Welcome to Family History Mysteries, a podcast that tells the stories uncovered through family history research, the unexpected stories of everyday people. I am an avid family historian who has been compiling my family tree for over 15 years, with nearly 20,000 people recorded in my trees.
And please put a review on my podcast. That will certainly help in getting the word out there and creating more listenership. Episode 172, The Australian Adventuress, Part 1. Barbara Turner Taylor was in a newspaper article in 1921 that stated Sydney detectives had discovered a book written by her titled The Life and Adventures of Barbara Taylor. Barbara Turner Taylor was actually born Florence Evelyn Forrest on the 20th of April 1877 at Branxton, near Maitland in New South Wales. She was the daughter of William Joseph Forrest and Sarah Wright. Her father was a schoolmaster and they lived at Morpeth in the Maitland area and at Denman near Muswellbrook in New South Wales. Barbara's parents had married in East Maitland in 1875 and Barbara was the second born of 4 children, 3 that survived infancy. In 1892 in Denham, Florence taught music at the Denham Public School while her father was headmaster there for a short period. Her father died in 1894 in Muswellbrook, aged just 42, when Barbara was 17. Florence married William Cuthbert Gillespie under her birth name in 1896 in Annandale, New South Wales, when she was 19 and William 33, and he became a pupil teacher in 1884 in Mudgee. They had a daughter, Elsie Gillespie, in Muswellbrook, New South Wales in 1897. By January 1899, it seems that they had separated, as there was an advertisement in the paper on the 14th of January 1899. I, William C. Gillespie, publicly announced that I will not be responsible for any debts contracted by my wife, F. E. Gillespie, after the 6th of July 1898. William C. Gillespie, Joja Creek. A month later, at the West Maitland Police Court, Florence Gillespie was charged with obtaining the sum of £3 by means of a false pretence with the intent to defraud William Blaw of East Maitland. Evidence of arrest was given by Constables Dahl and Gillies, and on the application of the police, accused was remanded to East Maitland, where she will appear on Friday with a bail granted for herself £50 and 2 sureties of £25 or one of £50. Mr. Fowler asked for a remand, as Dr. Alcorn had informed him that the defendant was not in a fit state to appear, so it was adjourned to the 24th. And in the Maitland Daily Mercury on the 24th of February 1899, it outlines the case. False pretences. Florence Gillespie, 21, a married woman, was charged with that she did, on the 6th of February, falsely pretend to Frederick William Blaw that she was sent by Sarah Forrest to get the sum of £3 and did thereby obtain it with an intent to defraud. Sub-Inspector Fowler conducted the case for the prosecution. The evidence of Constable Dahl, who had arrested the accused, taken at West Maitland, was read. Frederick William Blaw, public school teacher at East Maitland, knew the accused. About the 6th of the present month, she called upon him about 5 o'clock in the afternoon and showed him a letter which she said had emanated from her mother. The letter was read. On the representations made therein, he gave Mrs. Gillespie a cheque for £3. That cheque had been cashed. He had known the father and the mother of the accused, and the letter had aroused his sympathy, and as a friend he had advanced the money. Subsequently, he had seen the accused at the Belmore Hotel in West Maitland, and he had heard her say to Sub-Inspector Fowler that her mother wrote the letter. He had since discovered that the representations the accused had made were not true. Mrs. Gillespie said on that occasion that she had £2 but refused to take it, as he considered he ought to get the whole of his money, and that he ought to let the case go on, as the police then had the matter in hand. Subsequently, she offered him a cheque, but he would not take it. He made no appointment to meet her at 7 o'clock and get the money. He had seen her after he had obtained the money and threatened to give her in charge. She then said she would call and pay the money, but did not do so, and it was after 9 o'clock at night that he saw the Inspector of Police. Sarah Forrest, the mother of the accused, residing at Muswellbrook, read the letter given by Mrs. Gillespie, Mr. Blaw. It was very much like the witness's handwriting, but neither the writing nor the signature was here, and she had not authorised anyone to write such a letter. Neither had she given anyone authority to obtain money from Mr. Blaw on her behalf. Her daughter's husband lives at Joja Creek, but her daughter would not live with him. She knew Mr. Gillespie had advertised in the papers that no one was to give his wife credit on his account. Her daughter had no income of her own, and the witness had closed her doors against her. She supposed her daughter was in the world without a penny to bless herself with. It was her daughter's own fault that she was in such circumstances, not her husband's or the witness. The charge having been read over to the accused, she pleaded guilty. In the second case, she was charged with obtaining the sum of £5 on the 13th by false pretence from William Dudley Power. Constable Dawes said that he had charged the accused this morning. The cheque produced was the one that he'd seen on the 13th when it was cashed for the accused by Thomas Bellamy of West Maitland. The money so obtained was to pay Mr. Blore, but this was not allowed. William Dudley Power, medical practitioner of West Maitland, remembered the accused coming to him on the 13th. She said she wanted to go to Muswellbrook to see her mother, who was very ill, but she had no money to pay her fare, and asked him to lend her some and she would send it back in a few days. He gave her a cheque for £5. He'd been informed since that the representations she made were incorrect. Sarah Forrest had not sent any message to the accused on the 13th and was not ill on that date. The accused pleaded guilty and elected to be summarily dealt with. Although they could not excuse her in any way, they could not but remember that it was done to remove the consequence of a previous offence. Both matters were closely connected, and as this was her first offence, he appealed to the bench to deal as leniently with her as the cause of justice would permit. It was a pity to see that she'd fallen out with her husband, her mother, and all of her friends. She was in that position in which any man or woman would be driven to the commission of a similar act. He appealed to their worships as fathers of families, as men of the world, who knew how poor girls were driven to this sort of thing when they had not a friend in the world to turn to for a penny. He was certain both Mr. Blore and Dr. Power would be willing for the bench to deal out mercy as well as justice. He might inform the bench that another sad circumstance of the case was that the accused had a little child, 2 years old, with her. Sub-Inspector Fowler informed their worships that the accused had been in custody for 11 days. The chairman said it was a lamentable case and that he thought the mother should look after her daughter and give her another chance. The bench decided to impose a sentence of 1 hour in the first case and until the rising of the court in the second case. Sub-Inspector Fowler said the police had communicated with the husband of the accused. Mrs. Forrest informed the bench that the husband was willing to take her home again. Mr. Thompson said that if that was the case, he would undertake to see that she arrived safely. £5 of money found on the accused will be returned to Dr. Power and the remainder to Mr. Blore. The next we hear of Florence is in May 1899 in Brisbane, and the Brisbane Telegraph on the 20th of May 1899. False pretences, young woman sent to jail. At the City Police Court on Friday, Edna Florence Gillespie, alias Edna Lyle White, was charged with forging and uttering. Sergeant Shanahan conducted the prosecution. He said that he might inform his worship before the case was proceeded that the defendant was recently sentenced to 6 months' imprisonment on a charge of false pretences, whereby she obtained a sum of money from Mr. Potterman, licensee of Lennon's Hotel. The defendant was released under the Offenders Protection Act on her undertaking to pay Peterman the sum of £5. The defendant got 14 days in which to pay, but as she did not, a warrant of execution was issued and put into execution. It was found the defendant had no goods and the warrant was returned. He asked the bench to deal with the defendant under the 163rd section of the Justices Act, which rendered her liable to 6 months' imprisonment. Well, you have not paid the £5 you were ordered to. The defendant said she had written to her husband in New South Wales but had not received a reply. The defendant then ordered her to be imprisoned for 6 months. Sergeant Shanahan said under the circumstances the charge against the defendant for forging and uttering in New South Wales would be withdrawn. The defendant, who began to weep, was taken out of the court. And another article in the West Star and Roma Advertiser says a youthful adventuress, good looks and bad inclinations. Edna Florence Gillespie, alias Edna Lyle White, was presented in court. So the defendant is quite a young woman of prepossessing appearance, and on previous appearance in court she bore an infant in her arms. She on that occasion made some reference to the late Honorary James White of New South Wales, whom she declared was her uncle and with whom she asked permission to communicate. It is doubtful if she was succeeded in opening correspondence with the deceased famous horse owner. Her husband is a schoolmaster in New South Wales. Their daughter died in Queensland in July 1899, aged only 2, of typhoid fever. In that same month of her daughter's death, on the 18th of July 1899, Barbara was charged under the name of Edna Florence Gillespie at Singleton, New South Wales, for forging a bill of exchange with the intent to defraud. Sit at the Singleton Police Court on Monday under the name of Edna Florence Gillespie at Singleton, New South Wales, for forging a bill of exchange with the intent to defraud. And it says that the Singleton Police Court, Edna Florence Gillespie appeared in custody on a charge of forging a cheque. She is remanded until the next morning. It is alleged that the accused forged the signature of Brecht Brothers of Muswellbrook to a cheque and obtained cash for same from Mr. W.H. Mutton of Singleton several weeks ago. She was arrested in Brisbane and brought to Singleton by Constable Turner. And the details in the Singleton Police Court. Edna Florence Gillespie was charged with forging and uttering a cheque. Constable Turner gave evidence to the arrest of the accused at Brisbane and read the warrant to her at the local lockup. In reply, she said she knew of it as she had heard it read several times before. William H. Mutton, storekeeper, identified the accused as the person who came in on the 18th of April and obtained cash for a cheque purporting to be signed by Brecht Brothers of Muswellbrook and drew £12.15. The cheque was made payable to Mrs. Brecht, and the accused said that she was Mrs. Charles Brecht. The witness remarked to the accused that the cheque was irregular, as some alterations had not been initialled, but knowing the Brechts, he did not hesitate, as she told him that she and her husband were staying in town that day. In consequence of the representations made, he cashed the cheque. In a few days, the cheque was returned to him through the bank, the teller informing him that the document was marked a forgery. He afterwards set the police in motion and a warrant was issued for the accused's arrest. He'd never seen the accused before she came to the shop. Ernest Charles Brecht of Ignoron of Muswellbrook said that he knew the accused before the court. He'd seen her previously at Denham and Muswellbrook. He'd never given her any authority to sign cheques for the firm Brecht Brothers. The firm kept an account in the commercial bank at Muswellbrook. He knew her by her maiden name, Miss Forrest, and also as Mrs. Gillespie after she married. The accused said that she did not wish to say anything in reply to the charge, and the bench committed her to take her trial at the Maitland Quarter Sessions, with bail allowed for herself £200 and two sureties of £100 each. So on the 19th of September 1899, in the Quarter Sessions at Singleton, Edna Florence Gillespie, a married woman who's been living apart from her husband for some time, was found guilty and sentenced to 6 months' imprisonment. A list of 3 convictions for similar offences was read. During the hearing of the case, the accused, who was 21, sobbed bitterly and in the course of a broken statement said that she did not recollect anything about the affair and knew nothing of it till she was arrested in Brisbane beside the deathbed of her little girl. She said, "I never remember seeing Mr. Mutton until I saw him in the court on the 16th of July at the first hearing of the case. I knew nothing whatsoever of the matter until I was arrested in Brisbane with my dying baby on my knees suffering from typhoid fever, and my baby afterwards died." The accused then broke down and sobbed bitterly. In reply to His Honour, the accused said that she was 21, that she'd been living apart from her husband for 12 months. She had suffered much domestic trouble. Her own people turned against her and she was not strong enough to go into service or do hard work. And he sentenced her for 6 months in Maitland jail with light labour, and he said he was giving her a light sentence in the hope that what she had passed through would prove a warning to her in the future and that she would not again commit any act of character she was then suffering for. On the 29th of January 1903, William Gillespie resigned his position as a teacher and went to Western Australia. On the 6th of February 1903, Florence Gillespie, 24, a married woman, was before the North Sydney court on a charge of stealing 3 gold brooches, 2 gold rings, 1 gold earring, 1 purse, 3 baskets, 1 overcoat, 5 shirts and other articles at the total value of £18, the property of Florence Ellen Vilbert and Frank Vilbert. The accused, who had rented part of the same house as the prosecutors, was fined £20, in default 6 months' imprisonment. A month for payment was allowed on security being provided. She didn't pay the fine, and on the 29th of April 1903 a warrant of commitment was issued for Florence, and it stated that she was renting a room with her husband in North Sydney. So the Police Gazette says North Sydney, a warrant of commitment for the sum of £20 fine in default 4 months hard labour for larceny has been issued by the North Sydney bench against Florence Gillespie. She's 24, 5 foot 3 or 4 inches high, stoutish build, full face, large mouth, thick lips, large blue eyes, brown hair cut short, wears a fake fringe, a fresh complexion, generally dressed in a black skirt, a red blouse, white straw sailor hat or white linen hat, addicted to drink, rents a room with her husband, was formerly a public school teacher. Now, as we know, she'd been estranged from her husband for quite a long time and he was in Western Australia. However, this may explain who it might have been. On the 30th of July 1909 in Newcastle, New South Wales, she married James Richmond Tiernan when they were both 32, and she married him under the name Florence Harcourt. At this point, her first husband is still alive in Western Australia. They had a daughter, Barbara, on the 16th of September 1909 in Newcastle. In the Sydney Daily Telegraph on the 30th of July 1915, conspiracy alleged, solicitors loan to woman. Barbara Turner Taylor, 38, was charged at the Central Police Court yesterday with conspiring with other persons to cheat and defraud Charles Joseph McDonnell. Mr McDonnell is a solicitor and a senior partner in the firm McDonnell and Moffat, and he said that the accused visited him on the 10th of June last and said that her brother, Mr Robert Vernon Harcourt, was connected with ironworks in Birmingham, England, and visiting Australia. She wanted £20 until he arrived. The witness gave her the money. On subsequent dates, her sums aggregated to £325. In answer to Mr Prosser, who appeared for the defence, the witness said sympathy and false statements induced him to grant the accused with the money. He expected to be repaid without interest. Detective Robertson gave evidence of the arrest of the accused in Carlisle Street, Leichhardt, on the 21st of July in the presence of her husband. She asked the witness if he had arrested any of the others. He replied in the negative and desired to know who they were. She replied, "I would sooner hang than put my mates away." Asked what she'd done with the money, she said, "My share is £25. I am the mug." Constable Saunders said he'd known the accused for 25 years. He went to school with her at Denmead. Her name was Florence Forrest, and she was the daughter of a schoolmaster, and she was committed for trial. In the Sydney Sun on the 4th of August 1915, lent money freely, charge of conspiracy, woman and sick husband. Barbara Turner Taylor, 38, alias Gillespie, alias Tiernan, was committed by Mr King at the Central Police Court today for trial on a charge of conspiring with certain other persons unknown to cheat and defraud Edward William Martin large sums of money. The prosecutor said he was a member of the firm G.H. Martin and Company, P&O importers of Victoria markets. He knew the accused as Annie Turner, and in October 1913, she visited his shop and purchased a piano on the hiring system and paid an instalment and deposits up to £23. In March of last year, the accused called at his office. She was very distressed and asked for his help. She needed money for household expenses. 2 letters were produced by her, which the witness read. After that, she asked the witness to advance her £15. Previously, he'd lent her £7. He advanced her the £15, for which he got a receipt. Between March the 11th and March the 17th, he gave her other money, making up £30 altogether. The accused said that she was very sick and that her husband had gone to Perth to settle with her solicitor. 2 days later, Mrs Taylor returned and asked for another £10, which he gave her. Another 2 days elapsed and the accused returned and requested another £10, which she received. After a further period of 3 days, the witness handed her another £5 at her request. 3 days further on, March the 27th, the witness handed over another £10. On March the 31st and April the 1st, the witness gave the accused £3 and £7 respectively. Taylor explained that on the latter occasion that her husband had developed blood poisoning and was in hospital in Melbourne. Mrs Taylor was always very distressed when she went to the witness, and it was really out of sympathy that he advanced the money. Then on the 4th of April, £12 was given to her, and on the 6th of April, having stated that her husband's arm was going to be amputated, she asked for £20 and got it. On April the 9th, she received £16. Every time the accused called in at the prosecutor's office, she was very concerned about her husband and was terribly cut up over the thought that he was likely to lose one of his arms. On one occasion, Mrs Taylor said her husband was returning to Sydney and was then at Albury. As a consequence of letters received and shown him, the prosecutor sent the following telegram addressed to Taylor at the post office Albury. "Don't worry, old man. Take care of yourself. See you on arrival. Arranged for hospital at Summer Hill." He later received an official notification to the effect that the person whom the telegram was addressed was not known. When Mrs. Taylor repeatedly called for money, she explained that her husband was daily getting closer to Sydney. Thus, on one day he was at Goulburn, later on at Mossvale, and then at Fairfield. He was getting closer all the time. There was then laughter in the court. The total amount of money given to the accused was £309. It was the prosecutor's private money, and it had nothing to do with the firm. After receiving certain telegrams, he searched all over the place for the sick husband but failed to find him. On one occasion, he saw the accused at her house in Kensington, and she said, "Oh, Mr. Martin, I'm pleased to see you. I was going into town today to fix up with you." The witness went into town with her, and they parted with the understanding that she was to meet him the following afternoon to go to Strathfield in order to meet her husband to adjust matters. The accused did not keep the appointment, and that was the last the witness saw of her until recently. The reason he gave the accused the money was because he believed all the documents she showed him were genuine. The witness had a civil action against the accused and had obtained a verdict but had not received any of the money, and he also petitioned for her bankruptcy. So on the 11th of August 1915, it states that Barbara Turner Taylor, alias Gillespie, alias Tiernan, was charged on warrant with conspiring with others and defrauding Charles Joseph MacDonald and Edward William Martin large sums of money, and was arrested. She was committed for trial at the Quarter Sessions with bail allowed, identical with discharged prisoner Adina Florence Gillespie and offender Florence Gillespie from the Police Gazette of 1900. On the 15th of September 1916, it says a woman's downfall, gambling and horse racing. Barbara Turner Taylor, a married woman aged 36, pleaded guilty in the Sydney Quarter Sessions to falsely pretending to Charles Joseph MacDonald that she was entitled to a large sum of money from England, and that letters and cablegrams purporting to have been sent to her by a Robert Vernon Harcourt from England and Colombo were genuine documents by means from which she obtained money from MacDonald. The accused stated that her husband knew nothing of the transactions, and she tearfully pleaded for leniency, urging that she had one child and an aged mother. Her mother was 66 at this time, and that she would not get into trouble again. Mr. J. Abigail, who appeared for her, stated that he could only attribute her downfall to gambling and a passionate love of horse racing. Judge Docker, reading from a list, stated that it appeared that she had obtained by fraud a sum of £1,700 from one man alone, and in all £3,500. The woman was sentenced to confinement in the State Reformatory for Women for 2 years with light labour. 3 years later, on the 3rd of July 1918, advertising space available on cover of book entitled The Life and Adventures of Barbara Turner Taylor, ready for publication in a fortnight's time, copyrighted, guaranteed circulation. That was in Sydney. On the 21st of June 1919, she's had her book out, and now she is mentioned in the papers again in the Maitland Weekly. Story of Sick Brother. E. Bradley, or Barbara Tiernan, was charged at the Central Police Court, Sydney, with having obtained £23 from Ernest Osborne by means of false pretences. It was stated in evidence by Ernest Osborne that late in December last, the accused, with whom he had previously a business transaction, visited his business premises in George Street. She told him that her brother was seriously ill at Balladalar and asked him to lend her £2 so that she could go and visit him. He lent her the money. About 10 days later, the accused returned and said her brother was still severely ill and had to be transferred to the West Maitland Hospital. She produced a letter purporting to be written by her brother. The letter thanked Mr. Osborne for the advance and promised that he would return any money owing once he came to the hospital. He then gave her more money. The witness advanced her £5, £6 and £2. The accused said her brother was a personal friend of Dr. Harris of Newcastle. Harold Ivan Mannell, Secretary of the West Maitland Hospital, gave evidence denying that they had any person of the name of McGregor in the institution in December or January. The accused was committed for trial on a further charge in having obtained £153 from Ernest Maguire by means of false pretences and a false promise. She was remanded until the 13th of January, bail being fixed at £100. A month later in the quarter sessions, Barbara Turner, who was represented by W.D. McMahon, pleaded not guilty to a charge of having falsely pretended to Ernest Osborne that she was possessed of a large quantity of household furniture stored in Herresford Street, Glebe, and by having these means obtained from him the sum of £15. The jury returned a verdict of not guilty and the accused was discharged. However, 4 months later, on the 12th of November 1919 in Sydney, a warrant has been issued by the Central Police Bench for the arrest of a woman named E. Cooper, charged with endeavouring to obtain money from Alexander Knox by means of false representation at Sydney on the 23rd of September 1919, so a month after she was off the hook with the previous court appearance. She's described as 41, 5'5", stout build, dark complexion, brown hair, blue eyes, 2 moles on left cheek. Supposed to be identical with the offender Barbara Turner Taylor, alias Florence Gillespie. And again, there was an ad in regards to her book on the 28th of November 1919, half sharing copyright and publishing rights of book Life and Adventures of Barbara Turner Taylor, certain of big circulation throughout Australia. Price £400. For particulars, Brown's Agency in Bathurst Street. On the 24th of December 1919, it says Barbara Turner Taylor, alias Barbara Turner, alias Tiernan, alias E. Cooper, alias E. Bradley, alias Florence Gillespie, alias Adina Florence Gillespie, charged on warrant with obtaining the sum of £20 from Alexander Knox by means of false pretences, has been arrested in Sydney, sentenced to 6 months hard labour. And on the 4th of January 1920 in the Brisbane Truth, it outlines this in more detail. It said Detective Ramsey told her that a man named Alexander Knox, an agent of Bridge Street City, had issued a warrant for a woman named E. Cooper by fraudulent representation, and Barbara, with an air of breezy indifference, said, "I don't know anything about it." Later on at the police station, her attitude changed to one of defiance, because when he asked her whether she knew Knox, she retorted, "No, I do not. If you think I am the woman mentioned in the warrant, charge me and see how you get on." Thompson did charge her, but not before he'd brought Knox along and got him to identify Barbara as the belle who had imposed on his generosity and got away with it. Thompson asked her if she was a married woman with 4 children and if she lived in Balmain. In an angry tone, Barbara replied, "No, you know I only have 1 child and that I never lived in Balmain." Asked if she'd consulted Dr. Worrell with her view of being operated on for an internal growth, she replied, "Certainly not, I didn't tell Knox that either." And to a question as to whether she intended visiting a Mrs. White of Eden Glassy Station in Singleton, she snapped, "No, I didn't, and Knox is a liar if he says I did." "Well, did you get any money from him?" "Oh yes, a few pounds," confessed Barbara, "but he lent me that." The prosecutor, Alexander Knox, a general agent carrying on business in Bridge Street, told a long story of how he'd fallen victim to the tearful tales of the wily woman. The effect of it was that on September the 23rd, Barbara dropped into his office casual-like and anxiously inquired if he had a vacancy for a bookkeeper, as she was desperately in need of employment. Regretfully, he told her that he hadn't such a vacancy, but after a moment's reflection told her he had a vacancy for a typist. She told him that she couldn't type, and then for some reason that wasn't clear to him then, she, in a burst of confidence, told him that she was a widow and that she had come across to Sydney from Perth to be operated on by Dr. Worrell for an internal growth, and then went on to say that she was at present living in a room in Balmain with her 4 bonny children, 2 girls and 2 boys, but any moment she might be cast into the cold, lonely world because her rent bill was steadily mounting up and she was unable to put off the landlord who was demanding his pound of flesh. He asked her how she got herself into this predicament, and she said that she had a freehold property worth over £1,100 in Western Australia, and when she left there she placed it in the hands of her solicitors for sale, and she had expected the money long ago. Unfortunately, however, there had been an unaccountable delay, and the result was that she was living with only 10 pence to her name. All the other money she'd brought from Perth had been eaten up in the purchase of necessities. This tale, told in a tearful voice, made an impression on Knox. He took all that he had out of his pockets, 9 shillings, and gave it to Barbara, telling her to wire her agents in Western Australia and let them know she was in financial difficulties, and adding that, with the balance, she could purchase a little food for herself and her children. Barbara thanked him profusely, and as she shook hands and went away, he told her to come back and see him again if she did not get any answer from the wire. Barbara assured him she most certainly would, and added that she'd pay the money back. He told her not to worry about it. True to her promise, Barbara dropped in again the next day and gave Knox to understand that she intended to make him her confidant by reading a letter to him purporting to have been written by Mrs. White of Eden Glassy Station in Singleton. In this letter, the writer volunteered to set Barbara up as a music teacher in Singleton. Knox devoured the contents and then turned to Barbara expectantly. Then Barbara explained her difficulty, that she was without cash and she could not get a free ride to Singleton for herself and her 4 children. Knox's heart went out with her in pity, and he forthwith agreed to advance her the money for her to take her children with her. "If you can pay me back at any time, you can do so, and if you cannot, you need not worry about it," he said. He looked up the railway guide and ascertained fares for Barbara and her 4 children, which was £4 and 10 shillings, and gave it to her in an open cheque on the Bank of New South Wales for £5. The cheque was duly presented and cashed. Up until this time, no suspicion had entered his mind. So utterly sincere did the woman appear to be, and so well did she play the part of a lady in distress, that he was quite deceived, and made arrangements to meet her at the station to send her off. He kept the appointment, but Barbara did not. Suspicion then began to germinate in his mind. The next day, however, it was eradicated when a wire reached him from Newcastle. Over a week elapsed, and he was beginning to wonder whether the lady whom he met and helped under such strange circumstances had got on. The letter wrote that Mrs. White had rented and furnished a cottage for me at Singleton and set me up as a music teacher. Knox was curious as to how she got word from Western Australia. However, Barbara soon scattered the doubts or suspicions he had by producing a letter from the lady and the solicitors in Western Australia, and it was signed by Sir Walter James. The letter said that she was very foolish to leave Western Australia without making proper provisions for herself and her children, and that she only had to ask for an advance and she could have got it. And the writer said he was very sorry to hear of her illness in Melbourne and her sad plight in Sydney. The writer wound up by saying that he had sold her property for £1,100 and he was bringing the money across personally instead of remitting it, as he was visiting Sydney on other business. After Knox read the letter, Barbara again broached the subject of her illness and informed him she was going to see Dr. Worrell that day. Convinced that she was deserving of assistance, he advanced her £5 to enable her to go to the doctor. 2 days later, Barbara once more came and announced that she'd received another letter from Sir Walter James, written while in Melbourne, and stated that he would be in Sydney in 3 or 4 days. Barbara then requested a further advance of £4, pointing out, with her common clothes, she could not meet such a distinguished gentleman. She then said that she had a valuable costume in Moscow, as well as a quantity of good jewellery, which were given to her by Lady Forrest and other celebrities on her departure from Perth. On the strength of this representation, Knox wrote out an order for £4 on his Commonwealth Savings Bank account. It was duly presented and cashed. Some time later, Barbara again came in and informed him that Sir Walter had left the train at Goulburn and was motoring to Sydney, but had been delayed in Strathfield with a mishap with the car. After that, she disappeared completely. Barbara, who gave her surname as Turner, then entered the witness box and stated she lived in Millers Point with her husband. She declared that she never asked Knox for assistance, and any money he gave her was loaned by him of his own accord. She never mentioned Singleton to him, but told him she thought of opening a music class in Armidale, and Knox offered to advance her the money. She had plenty of money of her own at the time. When Knox gave her the money, he told her he didn't want it back, and it made no difference to him. The magistrate decided to convict. Mr. Leary asked for leniency, as she was a married woman with a 10-year-old daughter to care for. Then the magistrate asked, "Do you know anything about this woman, Sergeant?" "Yes," replied Sergeant Spire readily. "Her correct name is Barbara Tiernan. She's a married woman living with her husband. This child Mr. Leary speaks of was taken away from her on one occasion by the state. She has been carrying on this class of fraud for many years, and many convictions have been obtained against her at East Maitland, Brisbane, Singleton, North Sydney, and at the Sydney Quarter Sessions in 1915, when she got 2 years light labour. Her first conviction was recorded as far back as 1899. The tale-teller got 6 months, which in view of her record may be deemed to meet the case." And in the Perth Truth on the 17th of January 1920, Barbara's husband, Turnan's alleged threats, "I'll go to the gallows for you." There was a sequel to the case of Barbara Turner in the Central Police Court on Tuesday when James Tiernan, 42, a labourer, was brought before Mr. Fitzharding and charged by warrant with, on December the 19th, threatening Alexander Knox in the following words: "I'll shoot you, you blip. I'll go to the gallows for you, you blip." Knox asked for Tiernan to be bound over to keep the peace as he feared violence, and Tiernan was remanded until December 29 and allowed £80 bail. On the 26th of February 1920, so a month later, the following appeals against magistrates' convictions will be heard in the courtroom at Queen Square. Barbara Turner for false pretences. So tune into part 2 to see what kind of misdemeanours might be ahead for Florence Forrest. And I'll also cover her family members and what became of them.
If you are interested in sharing your story on my podcast, Family History Mysteries, please go to my Facebook page and send me a message. If you would like some assistance in filling in the gaps in your family tree to see what mysteries you solve, please get in touch. And don't forget, you can have early access to episodes by subscribing, and you'll also gain access to bonus episodes.